I want to welcome everybody that might be joining us on our YouTube channel. We're glad that you're with us this morning. If you have any questions about what we speak, what we teach, what we preach, what we believe, Church of Christ, we invite you to please reach out to us. We would love to talk with you and help you understand a little bit better about the Lord's church in Smyrna. You want to turn to Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 24. Luke chapter 15, we'll get our sermon from this morning, our lesson. The idea of the prodigal son. Sermon on the prodigal son. This is part of a trilogy of parables that Jesus speaks in regards to what is lost and is then found. And of course, if you've ever studied the Bible, even in the smallest bit, you know about the parable of the prodigal son. It's one that is spoken of even in the secular world. People use an example of the prodigal son. It's interesting that just a little bit of a background. When we think of the idea of prodigal, a lot of people think of the idea of prodigal, the word prodigal meaning someone who is lost and is returned. That's not what prodigal means. Prodigal means marked by excessive spending or waste. So now you know, when it talks about the prodigal son, we know that when he goes into that far country and he wastes his living on riotous living, that's what marks him as prodigal, not the idea that he was gone and then came back again. So just a little bit of background kind of help you maybe understand it a little bit better. So now we understand, prodigal son, this is what he did. And it's interesting that that's what they mark him at. And that's not really the point of the verse or the point of the parable, although it's certainly a portion of it. I'm going to break this sermon up into two sections. There's two sections to it. I had 8 pages of material, and I know that as much as you love to hear me stand up here and talk, you might not want to be here for 2 hours listening to me stand up here and talk. So I said, I'll do you a favor. I'll break this up into 2, so you'll have to come back next week and hear the second portion of this. The idea of the prodigal son, you know that it's the sentiment behind the parable, the scope of the parable, and its message has been the source of inspiration for so many lessons throughout the centuries, and it's also been pointed to as a beacon of hope for so many. So many people have friends and family that have wandered away from the truth, and we keep looking to that example of the prodigal son as someone who, while they left, while they were gone, they eventually came back and they were welcomed with open arms. And we'll have to talk about the idea about that prodigal son being welcomed back. And that's a very important part of the parable that Jesus is trying to teach us. The main lesson behind it, what's the main lesson? Well, God not only accepts penitent sinners, He actually seeks their salvation, and when they are returned to them, He restores them to where they once were. He doesn't relegate them to a lowly position so that they have to build themselves back up in His sight. He says, when I receive you back as if you had never left. I don't put you on probationary period as you come back to me. I don't put you down lowly and make you work your way back up through the system. You know, that's unique to God. Many of the other false gods that were taught at this time had that was a very important part of it, the idea that you worked your way up in respect from your God. That's not the way God is. God loves us all equally, and when He restores us, He restores us completely and totally. A little bit of a background. There are many precious words in the English language. There are words that mean so much to us, but one that means probably more than most is the idea of home. Think about that, the idea of the word home and what it means to us. Everybody here, as soon as I said that word, you started thinking about home. Many people, for us, our home is where we now currently reside. This is where we live. When we leave this place, we are going to go home. We're going to go back to our house, which also coincidentally is our home, and we're going to enjoy our afternoon in our own home. When we travel, when we go away, we enjoy our trip most of the time, but you know what? We always say, I enjoyed my time, but I was just really ready to get back where? Home. I wanted to go back to what was familiar to me. Some people, that's not the case. Where you're living now is not really, you don't really consider that your home. To you, home may be in another town, it may be in another state, it may be in another country. This is just a temporary place that you happen to find yourself for a period of time, but what you would really like to is eventually get back home where your family is, or where you grew up, where you were born, whatever it might be. Many people this very hour are thinking of home and how much they would like to be home. There are people in prison right now who would love nothing more, especially with the holidays coming up, to get out and come home. But unfortunately, they are there. And there's nothing they can do about that until they are either released or, unfortunately, until many of them die. They are never going to go back home. Some in the military, the idea and the rallying around the military is, I think, a great thing, and it's very indicative of us as a people. But there's so many people that are now serving overseas. They're serving in foreign countries. They're serving, and many times they're serving in this country, but they're not close to home. And right about now, especially once again with the holiday season, there are a great many of our men and women who are serving in the military who would like nothing more than to walk into their house on Christmas Day and say hi to their family. They are thinking of home right now. There are people in hospitals, sick, been there maybe in some cases for quite some time, and they would love to get back home. They'd like to get out of that place and go back home again. Some people who are in nursing homes, they're there because they can no longer physically take care of themselves. They rely on care, and while that is not to them, you ask them, is this home? They will tell you very quickly, this is not my home. I would love to go home, but I can't go home. I can't take care of myself. The reason that this parable was spoken by Jesus Christ, it was taught because there were some who were not glad to see sinners come back home. That's still true in the church today. Sometimes there are some, when someone is penitent, with a penitent heart, they come and they repent. There are some who are not really that happy to see that sinner come back home. They still have something going on in their mind that perverts their sense of justice, and they do not want to see that brother or sister return home. In Luke chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, I know you've got chapter 15. Go ahead and turn to verses 1 and 2. And here's this very, very real concept. We see this played out in front of Jesus as he's speaking to these people. We see it played out in front of him, in his face. And the beautiful thing about Jesus is he was never fooled by people who came to him and spoke to him. There were those who came and tried to trick him. They would try to say things. They would twist words. They would twist concepts. He was never fooled by that. Why? Because he was his Father and he could see into their hearts. So what happens in verses 1 and 2? It says, then all the tax collectors and sinners. I love how it mixes those two together. It's almost as if they're interchangeable. All the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. Well, why would they want to hear him? Well, even bad people sometimes like to hear good things. And this is what's happening. They drew near to him and they wanted to hear what he had to say. And the Pharisees and scribes complained. Of course they did. Because they're scribes and Pharisees. This is what they did. They liked to complain. It kept them in business. They loved to be able to point out that mote in someone's eyes while all the while overlooking the beam in their own. So they complained and they said, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So there's already a problem, even back in the days of Christ, that people did not want to see sinners return home. And Jesus preaches this parable while he's talking to, of course, to the tax collectors and the sinners. You better believe he wanted the Pharisees and the scribes to hear it. This is for them, but you need to listen, because this is directed to you as well. And he tells them this story. He relates this parable to them at the very end, which is the part where most people kind of shut off. The very end, he talks about the older brother's attitude towards that younger brother who had returned back home. That was a little lagniappe for the Pharisees and the scribes. So this is for you. I know you're listening to me. The first part of it was for these people because they're sinners and they need to come back home. The second part of it was you. You need to change your attitude about this brother or sister who's been restored. We need to have the same kind of attitude towards the lost as God does. We have no right to think differently. If God can forgive the sin, and remember, we look at the idea of a sin. Look how this person has trespassed against me. Look how they have treated me. They have been abysmal to me. They have run roughshod over my feelings. They do not care about me. And then, of course, we put on that air of pious behavior and that martyrdom. Look how they've hurt the church. Look what they've done. So many times we look at it and we say those very things, but we have to remember this, of all the things that have been done to us, the worst damage has been done to our God in heaven. He receives the brunt of this. No matter what we receive physically, he receives 10 times worse. Why? Because he's the one that gave up his son to die on the cross. We didn't do that. We didn't put Jesus on that cross. We didn't send him down here. God did that, and when people sin, they sin first against God. They trespass against us, but they sin against God, and they put his son's name to shame when they do so. So when we sit there and act as if we've been more hurt than God, we're fooling ourselves. And we don't need to give the world that impression that somehow what somebody has done to us is worse than what they've done to God. They have done far worse to him than they've done to us. And what is God's attitude? If you come back to me, I'll restore you. We have no right to look at it any differently. If someone comes back to us and begs our forgiveness and repents, we have no right to do anything other than to say, I want you back. More than anything, I want you back. Everything else we can work through. Any hurt feelings that I might have, any physical damage, anything, any emotional or financial damage you might have done to me, we can work through that. That's nothing compared to our relationship, and above all, your relationship with the God. Because guess what? When God receives them back, even if we don't, they've still been restored, whether we like it or not. God still looks at me and he says, you're back with me. That's now this person's problem. That's their attitude that they need to check. But when a brother or sister is restored to God, that relationship is rock solid. It's us that needs to work oftentimes on our relationship and our attitude and our acceptance of God's forgiveness towards others. God longs for us. He looks for us. He searches for us, and He puts forth effort for the lost. Every day that father got up and he went to the door and he looked for his son. And we think about it, that's all he did. This man had resources at his disposal. Do you think he might have sent some folks out to look for his son? I think so. It doesn't say that he did that, but I know that if I were a father and I loved my son, and I had heard word that he was in another place, you better believe I'm going to go looking for him. We don't know that he didn't. We don't know that he didn't find him and say, please come back home. And that son, still in that state of rebellion, say, I don't want to come back. I don't want to come back and live under your rules. I don't want to come back and have to be called your son. I want to do what I want to do. I want to make my mark in this world. And what a mark he made. Boy, he really tore it up, didn't he? He let the world know that he was in charge, didn't he? He made a fool of himself. And in doing so, unfortunately, dragged his father's name down into the mud. All of this is a little background regarding the parable. There's so much more to it oftentimes than we look at. We think of it as very simplified, and it's not. There's so many layers to it. And I want to encourage you this afternoon, come back at 1 o'clock for our hermeneutics class. I know it's that word just, I don't want to go learn about hermeneutics. We're going to talk about parables. How do we read a parable? How do we understand it? How do we understand it? How do we interpret it? We're going to talk about this one this afternoon. So come back at 1 o'clock. Okay. All right, now Jesus shows that there are basically 3 types of sinners. I want you to think about this. You write it down if you got a piece of paper. There's 3 types of sinners. 1, and here's the different parables. I told you there were 3 parables, the trio of parables of lost and restored. Number 1 is the parable of the lost sheep. Parable of the lost sheep. Here's the type of sinner we find in the parable of the lost sheep. We have a sinner that is lost and doesn't know how to get back. This is the sinner that is lost but doesn't quite know how to get back home. There are those out there right now that are like that. They think they are so far gone. They think they are so far down. They believe themselves to be so removed from God, they don't understand. Any removal from God is removal from God. There's no definition of length or distance. God doesn't say, well, you're this far removed, you're too far gone, but if you were a little bit closer, I could get to you. He says, space doesn't mean anything to me. I don't care how far away you are. You can be so to the point where nobody can see you, but guess what? You're just as far removed from me if you were a little bit. I can bring you back. I can pull you back to me if you'll just come back to me. But there are sinners who are lost and don't know how to get back. Then there's the parable of the lost coin. This is the parable of someone who's lost and doesn't even know it. That makes up most of the world in which we live. They are lost and they don't even know they're lost. How sad is that? How sad is that? To be lost and not even realize it. Because you know what? If you don't realize you're lost, you're not making any effort to be found. You just stumble through life thinking this is the way things are. This is the way life is supposed to go. And I'll just continue to stumble on through life, and the small victories that I have, I'll count those as small victories, but I don't realize that there's anything wrong. That's that type of sinner. And then we have the parable of the prodigal son. This is one who was lost and knew how to get back, had not yet reached the point in which they were willing to do it, to put forth the effort. And once he realized how little effort it took to get back to God, don't you know he was glad at the end? Boy, he was so thankful that he finally, it even says it in the scripture, it says, when he came to his senses, which tells us what? When we're outside of God, when we're removed from God, we're not in our right mind. I'm not saying we're clinically insane. I'm not saying any of that kind of thing. I'm saying when we're removed from God, when once we were in a good place where everything that we needed was provided for us, everything that was there for us to enjoy at our own pace, it was a beautiful situation. Anyone who would say, you know what, I don't want this anymore. I'm going to go, you know what I think I'm going to do? I'm going to go into a far country and I'm going to sleep with the pigs and eat what they eat. I'm telling you, anybody that would decide to do that instead of living in a household with their father where everything was provided and he would be basically a prince, son of the king, son of the ruler, anyone who would choose to do something otherwise has something wrong with them. There's something up here that's just not clicking. And that's what's exactly occurring in the parable of the prodigal son. He was lost, and he knew how to get back, just wasn't quite in a place where he was ready to make that admission and to do exactly what was necessary. All right, so let's look at it. Let's discuss it for just a few moments before we finish up. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 13. So we know who he's speaking to here. He's speaking to those tax collectors and the sinners, those that were gathered together, they were listening. And you know, they were those that knew that they were lost. These were people who knew the law. They knew that they were outside of God, and they were searching for how do I get back? I know I'm lost. I know how to get back, but I'm not quite sure how to get back. I'm too far gone. So he tells them. He says, then he said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he's basically asking for his inheritance. You know, when you die, there are things that are going to be coming to me. And I you know what? I don't want to wait. I want to go ahead and take that which is lawfully mine, that which would be given to me anyway. Please give me the portion of goods that would fall to me. So the father, you know that it skips over a little bit. It skips over a little bit. You know that father pleaded with his son. He remonstrated with his son. He begged his son, don't do this. You don't know what you're going to do. But callow youth, inexperienced, naive. I think I know what I'm doing, Dad. I think I got this under control. I think I'll be okay. You've taught me well, and I think I can make my way out in the world. You know that's what's happening because no father in his right mind would just give his son a ton of money and allow him to go out into the world that he was not familiar or comfortable with, a place that was not his own, where he would be a sojourner and not a member of the family. So he divided to them his livelihood. You know he was doing it with a sorrowful heart. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there became that prodigal son. What does it say he did? He wasted his possessions with prodigal living, with riotous living. In some translations, it says riotous living, wasteful, overly spendy. You know what happens? He went into town, and he shows up, and I'm sure he was dressed in his traveling clothes. He was dressed nicely, and he shows up with all of his money. And you know that there are people in towns that are looking for people like that because they are an easy mark. And you know he fell into some companions that did not care for him one bit. All they saw, in our speak, was dollar signs. They saw a young man that had plenty of money and was happy to impress all of his new friends with all of his ability to, buy the next round, or hey, we're going to have a feast, or hey, we're going to do this. Hey, if you'll lend me this, I'll gladly repay you. And there he goes. He wastes it all, and he spends it. He, in a very short period of time, that which had taken his father so many years to build up as a legacy to his son has taken it and wasted every penny. He had nothing in reserve. There was nothing left. He wasted it all with prodigal living. So, we're looking at the story here, the idea of the parable, but there's, of course, a meaning behind it. Well, what's the meaning? What's going on here, really? Well, there's two losses. There are two losses. The loss here is twofold. Number one, God loses man. God loses man. The father lost his son. That one, his son was living at his house under his roof. He was to take half of everything that he had anyway. He was going to be an owner in that which his father had worked so hard and so long to establish. And the father loses the son. He goes away because he not only he rejected him, and that's really at the heart of this. The son rejected the father in the same way that the sinner rejects God today. There's two losses. The father loses the son, which means that God loses man. This grieves God when he loses us. He doesn't look at us as expendable. He doesn't say, well, what's one person among 7.5 billion people in this world? What's one person? He grieves over every single one of us individually as if we were the only one that was important to him. He loves all of us equally. And when he sees people in foreign countries who have never heard his word, he grieves over them as much as he grieves over anybody else. It grieves him. Why is that? Why does that grieve God? Well, we find the answer in John chapter 3 and verse 16, and everybody knows that. Why does it grieve God? Because God so loved the world. That's why it grieves him. He loves us. You grieve over people that you love. If I have a passing acquaintance and that passing acquaintance no longer wants anything to do with me, I bid them farewell. It doesn't hurt me. It's not bothersome to me. I don't lie awake thinking, how can I get this passing acquaintance back in my life? That's not a big deal to me. I may be sad to see him go, but not overtly sad. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a passing acquaintance. He says, God, I knew you when I formed you in the womb. I knew you from the very beginning. When I knit you together, I knew you. I love you. When I lose you, it hurts me. We can't understand the hurt of God. We don't understand it. When we lose friends, it hurts, but it's not the same. When God loses a child, it hurts him. It grieves him that it occurs because he loves us so much. That's the first loss. And then there's a second loss. We lose God. We lose God. We've wandered away from him. We get to the point where we look around and, he was right behind me. You ever seen that? It's the most petrifying thing in the world when you're a parent, you're walking with your children, and you turn around and they're not right behind you, isn't it? Petrifying. It's terrifying. Even if it's for the briefest 5-second period until it's like, oh, I didn't realize they were on this. It's a terrifying thing. Well, guess what happens? When mankind loses God, it's terrifying. Terrifying. It's a loss. It's a loss. It's as much of a loss as anything else that we can encounter. In Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2, Isaiah 59, verses 1 and 2 tells us, Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, nor is his ear heavy, that it cannot hear. But what? Your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. The idea here is once we turn our backs on God, once we lose God, we don't see his face anymore. It's hidden from us. The light that he provided is no longer illuminates our life. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, God is not a part of my life anymore, and they know how different that makes them feel, how badly that makes them feel. But you know what? They don't make any effort to make any change about it. They feel that they can't do anything. I don't know. I'm not sure what it is. I don't know what goes on in that mindset. But they know for a fact that something is missing. They're not the person that they used to be. Their life is not the same that it used to be. God, though, has provided man a way back. Mark 16:16, He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he that believeth not will be condemned. Man can lose God, God can lose man, but God provides a way back. Always. There's nothing that we can do in regards to providing a way back to God. Every bit of that comes from God himself. There's nothing that we can do in and of ourselves to be restored back to God. It is only through God's grace and giving us the pathway. God blazes that trail, not us. We also know that the Son was lost through self-will. There was a loss there. Father lost the Son as God loses man. The Son lost the Father, we lose God. But we have to remember this. Under no circumstances is it anybody else's fault besides ours. Not one person's fault besides ours. It's certainly not God's. God didn't drop us off like the fairy tale. He didn't drop us off in the woods, and hopefully we've laid a bread trail to get back home. He didn't drop us off in the woods and then head on out. Say, well, find me if you can. When we get lost in those woods, it's because we walked out of there, walked into those woods of our own accord, and decided that's what we're going to do. We can't blame somebody else. Well, this person fooled me. He led me into something that I didn't think I was getting into. You know, Eve tried that excuse, or Adam tried that excuse with Eve, didn't he? Who was under condemnation? Adam. Why is it? Because he did it anyway. He did it anyway. That's why Adam was under condemnation. He was self-willed and decided to sin against God. God told Adam as much as he told Eve, don't eat of that fruit. Don't eat of that fruit. Don't eat of that fruit. And what is Adam's excuse? Well, the woman deceived me. That's a poor excuse, and it didn't fly with God. Any excuse that we make is not going to fly with God. Well, my friends pulled me away from you. This preacher told me something that wasn't true, and I believed it instead of believing the word, and it's his fault. This elected official, this brother in Christ, this person, you know, that's a common thing in this in the world today anymore. It's everybody else's fault besides ours. It's this person. It's this person. Nobody wants to take responsibility. Well, guess what? At the end of the day, it is all about personal responsibility. God expects it from us, so we need to expect it from ourselves as well. But it is through self-will that the Son was lost. James chapter 1, verses 13 through 16 tells us, gives us a great, this is it. This is it. We are lost through self-will, our decision to do what we do. James 1, verses 13 through 16 says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. God's doing this to me. He's trying to test me. No, God's not tempting you. For God cannot be tempted by evil, neither does he let himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted, and here we go. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives forth death. So whose fault is it when we are pulled away? It is ours and ours alone. The temptation is there. We have the ability and the opportunity to say, I will not. But what do? I will. I'll dip my foot a little bit in that pool. I'll try to live my life both in the church and in the world. I can do that. I'm a grown person. I can accomplish that. I'm pretty good at being able to turn. No. Once you're in the world, if you're halfway in the world, you're in the world. You can't be halfway in the world and in Christ. It just doesn't work that way. But don't deceive ourselves. Anything that we do is of our own accord. And because of this self-will, the Son desired to go into a far country and to take a portion of his Father's goods with him. It was his decision. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to strike out on his own and make his own way. Well, you know, when we leave God, that's really what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to make our own way. We're self-willed. I can develop my own morality. I can design my own morality. I'm righteous in my own eyes, and that's all that really matters. The world is full of people who do that, are doing it today. I don't need to be at church. I can worship God in a deer stand and view the beautiful world in which God has made. I can be on a boat fishing, and I can just me and God, we're communing one with another. Doesn't work like that. Doesn't work like that. But that's what we've done. We have created our own sense of morality. This young man, he wanted to see the world. He wanted to, as the saying goes, eat, drink, and be merry. Self-will causes a lot of people in the world today to waste their lives on things that are of no importance. What did he waste? He wasted money. Does money mean anything anyway? Does money have any lasting value? No, it doesn't. And that's exactly what he did. He wasted his money. He wasted his entire inheritance on stuff that was of no importance whatsoever. And because of self-will, the son made demands of his father. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17, it states that the oldest son would receive a double portion, which means the oldest son would have received 2/3 of his father's property, and the youngest son would have received 1/3. So 1/3 of everything that would have come to him was given to him. And he made that demand of his father. He really had no right to do so. The son had no right to do that. That inheritance was only supposed to be given upon the death of the father, not before. But he demanded it of his father, give me. And he used those words, give me that which would come to me anyway. The father could have said, no, I will not. You'll have to wait until I die. But he gave it to him anyway. He allowed him to go and make the decisions that he made. We have to be careful what we ask for. God might just give it to us. And this son, this prodigal son, this wayward son, is a reminder that self-will separates us from the Father that knows what's best for us and truly wants what's best for us. And we're going to stop there. We'll pick back up next week. I hope you come back for that. I hope you come back from that. Because there's going to be, I got a couple things I'd like to tell you about the son, the father, and the older son that you may not have heard before, and I think that might be very beneficial to you, and I want you to come back for that. But the idea here is, of course, we know what happens at the end of this story. We do know that this son came to himself. We know that he says, I'm going to go back to my father's house. And there may be someone here who needs to come back to the father's house. You've been away. You've realized that you've wasted a lot of time on things that mean absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. They won't avail you of anything. At the end of the day, they are of no importance, no consequence whatsoever. What is important is our obedience to our Father. And if you need to make that right, we want you to do that this morning. Whatever the need might be. You need to come to Him and be baptized for remission of sins and water. We want you to do that this morning. You need the prayers of repentance and confession. We want you to do that this morning. Whatever your need might be. Come while we stand and while we sing.